Welcome to Limitless, the Blind Beginnings podcast where seeing things differently inspires limitless possibilities. This podcast is being brought to you by Blind Beginnings, an organization based in Vancouver, Canada, that supports children and youth who are blind or partially sighted, along with their families. Limitless was created in order to inform, educate, entertain, and share stories from within the blind and partially sighted community in order to show the world that the opportunities for those who are blind or partially sighted are truly limitless. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to your host, the Executive Director and Founder of Blind Beginnings, Shawn Marcellet.
Welcome back to Limitless, the Blind Beginnings podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Marcellet, and I'm so happy that you have joined us again this week. If you listened last week, we talked to Lily, who attended a school for the blind, which I have to admit sounded fantastic. And I would say Lily's experience is an example of how segregating people who are blind could be a positive. Today, we want to dig a little deeper into talking about integration versus segregation. And I have three wonderful co-hosts with me today for this conversation. Welcome back, Clement, Ishita, and Nika.
Good morning.
Hello.
Wow.
Okay, so maybe you can start by, I think all of you have been on the podcast enough that we don't necessarily need to explain your level of vision at great length, but maybe tell our listeners sort of whether you've mostly been integrated, segregated, combination of both. What's your experience?
For me personally, I think growing up when I was younger, I dealt with a lot more kind of segregated activities. And then as I got older, I slowly kind of shifted to more of a hybrid of also getting more involved in the community and doing integrated extracurriculars.
For the most part, I've actually been integrated. I could, like, from everything I can remember, from school to extracurricular activities to volunteering, I've always had a more integrated experience. And the reason I wanted to share my experience on this podcast is because that's actually something that my family really pushed for throughout my life. So that was primarily the experiences that I've had.
My experience has always kind of been somewhere in the middle of the road. More towards, I mean, it really depends on what you ask me, but I would say I've had a little bit of both, a lot of both growing up. And nowadays I'm still trying to find that perfect balance between the two, because there are definitely times when one works better than the other. So it's an ongoing journey of trying to find the best point where both can kind of meet together.
And I would say when I was growing up, it was pretty much entirely integration, because I only really had an experience of being with other people who were blind at summer camp for 1 week of the year. And then as I sort of found that how amazing that experience was, I looked for opportunities to be with my people or segregated, I guess. But real life is integration for the most part, except that I work in the blindness field. So then I have this weird balance of, like, I get to live in this little segregated blind bubble, but then I get to work in this little segregated blind bubble, but then I live in a predominantly sighted world where I'm integrating all the time. So I thought maybe we could start by defining these two terms for people. And I actually looked them up in the dictionary. So integration, the act of bringing together smaller components into a single system that functions as one. Segregation, the act or practice of setting apart or separating of people or things from others, or from the main body or group. So I thought maybe we could discuss some examples of each of these things. Maybe let's start with integration, like, some of the places that we've been integrated.
Well, I guess one, the kind of the most obvious one, at least in most of Canada, is the school system. We not to say it's perfectly integrated, because it's not, and I think everybody could acknowledge that. But that is one of the places where we try to integrate kids with disabilities, or any of many differences, really, all sorts of diverse backgrounds, into the same kind of system. And I think that's kind of the one that's most apparent, I would say.
That's where I did a lot of my branching out, is not just school, but also extracurriculars related to
Hmm.
schools. Like I was in Model United Nations and the school play and choir, and I think that worked really well for me personally.
Yeah, roughly the same for me. Throughout school, I was always integrated with the other students. And like I mentioned in the intro, my parents actually really pushed for this. I did have the opportunity to go to a different school where I would be in a separate classroom and with other students with disabilities. But my parents pushed for the idea for me to be in an integrated school because they believed that it would better prepare me for life outside of school. And another way that we see this is through volunteering. I've always been in volunteering experiences that involved other sighted people. And that really did help me prepare for having to deal with the challenges of like advocating for myself or having to work around challenges and collaborating with other people. I really think that the integrated model that my parents wanted me to follow really did support me with that.
I also feel like recently I've been doing a lot of integration because I'm involved in a couple youth councils. I'm in the BC Youth Council, and I'm also in the North Vancouver Youth Council for my MP. And I'm the only person with a disability on those councils, as far as I'm aware. And I've also started doing gymnastics a few months ago, and I'm in a adult gymnastics class, and I don't have to do any special adaptations.
I'm curious about something. Ishita, you mentioned earlier how your parents pushed you to be more integrated so that it would help in later experiences.
Mhm.
I find that really interesting because you and I talk about this all the time, but we come from similar cultures, but the approach our parents took is like day and night opposite. Where my parents always wanted me to find the other blind kids and be around blind people, and it was the case of you can only do these jobs because you're blind, and so there wasn't really an attempt to kind of push me out of the blindness space. And I'm curious to know, like, as somebody else who's from like a more ethnic background, what's like a non-Western background, why do you think that is?
I don't know. Like, when I asked my parents, it was always that we just want you to get the full experience of
Hmm.
whatever you're doing. So it was
Hmm.
a school. We want you to be immersed in school like everyone else.
Hmm.
We want you to get the full experience of being on a team, like I was on the basketball team,
Hmm.
or getting all the volunteering experiences, because like they genuinely believe that that's what I would help me uh, in life when I get a
Yeah.
job, when I go to university,
Yeah.
because there, a lot of places don't really have segregated, I would say, areas for those.
Hmm.
And
Sure.
I don't really think that they knew too much about Blind Beginnings and CNIB. They did know about like volunteering and camps, but unfortunately, because I was in an integrated system, I didn't have too much time before those
Right.
activities.
Right.
So from what I know, it was just like they thought it was the best way to prepare me for life. And we did get a lot of people saying, wouldn't she struggle less in a
Mm.
segregated, well, they didn't say segregated, but in a
Mm.
situation where there were other students like her.
Hmm.
And anytime that they said that, my parents would just say, she's doing fine. She's doing good.
That's really interesting. So would you say that's, now that you've met other kids who have disabilities who are also from the same culture, like would you say that it's like would you say your parents were a little bit more of an exception than the rule?
I think so for the
Hmm.
most part. Of course, I
Okay.
think there are like people who do believe what my parents believe, but for the most part, I've seen that it is a more quote unquote, I would say, protect approach,
Uh-huh.
where it's
Yeah,
we want to keep
for
them
sure.
not, I wouldn't say safe, but we want to keep them like where they don't have to face as many difficulties,
Yeah,
where
for sure.
things come easier, I would
For
say. And
sure.
I'm not saying that segregation allows for that, but that's kind of the mentality that I've noticed.
Yeah, and I
Um,
would agree with that. I've noticed that
yeah.
too.
So that's kind of how I would say. I do think my parents are a little bit more like throw her out to the wolves. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, they're kind of more willing to push boundaries than what you would typically expect from cultures like ours, right?
Yeah, and I think I personally found that very helpful because I think it showed me that they had faith in me and that they believed I could push boundaries myself and do as well as any other student. So I think integration personally worked best for me, but I think everyone's different.
Sure, exactly. And I was gonna say, I would have actually felt the same way, but it's just really interesting to me how again, similar cultural backgrounds, similar kind of philosophies to a lot of things that our parents would take. But in that area, it's like, wow, like there's 180-degree difference in the way they approached it.
Well, and just interesting if anyone has been attending our Exploring Work Wednesdays, and they will be posted on our website. We're working on that. We've been interviewing working adults who are blind or partially sighted. And one of the questions is always, what did your parents do that helped you? And so often the answer is, they just treated me like any other kid. They encouraged me to try whatever I wanted to try. They didn't coddle me, basically. So, yeah.
That's like so weird because my parents are, they're in the middle. And they're like that with some things and not with others. So like with fashion and makeup and stuff, my mom would always say, like, I dressed you in cute outfits when you were a baby because I wanted to show people that, blind people can look, pretty and care about their looks. And she was always encouraging me to make sighted friends. But then she also had the mentality of, oh, I can only do certain extracurriculars and certain careers. But then in an academic setting, she really pushed me to get involved in different academic clubs. And when the school was kind of considering moving me to more of an LAC type program, they pushed back against that. So they're almost kind of in the middle, but depending on the topic, they'll flip-flop to one side.
That's funny. And my parents just denied that I had a visual impairment for most of my childhood. So there was all integration. It was like, I didn't even get to learn Braille, for example, because I would have asked too many questions about why am I learning Braille? So yeah, I think that's not good either. I think, being all the way at the other end of the spectrum of not even acknowledging that there is a disability of any kind is probably not ideal, but
yeah. And so my parents were the other extreme where it was very, very clear that I was the blind kid. And, there were things that were going to have to be done differently for me as opposed to, my 24 or so cousins who were of similar age to me. So that was always a thing growing up as well. So, and it was weird, again, culturally, for cultural context, growing up in two worlds, growing up in a world in the Canadian school system that taught integration as a good thing, or at least taught, to search for that balance that I was talking about earlier, and then to come home and have it tip all the way to the other end, to where you're blind, which means you can't go biking with your cousins, or if they're going to go play in the yard, you have to stay inside and listen to your audiobooks because
that's awful.
So it's just really interesting to have this conversation because of how widely ranged the experiences are. We can already see from just barely starting that it's kind of run the gambit to, no, you don't have a disability, to they're kind of flip-flop to, well, we believed in integration in spite of your disability, and to you're disabled, ergo nothing else can happen. So
I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, but are there other benefits, do you think, to integration? I feel like we've sort of talked about how it prepares you for reality. Is that the big one, or are there other things?
There's two other reasons for me, and the first one would be the most important for me personally, which is I think the more programs that I participate in, the more people I will be able to educate about blindness and visual impairment. for example, like doing my gymnastics class, none of the staff or the coaches met someone who is visually impaired. And now that I go there, they know. And that's kind of like 5 people who I educated more about blindness and visual impairment. And the second reason would be this is kind of a thing, is I'm very stubborn and I like proving people wrong, I guess.
Yes. Yep. I'm with
so
you.
like all the things, it's like, well, haha to the physiotherapist who said I couldn't do gymnastics when I was 4, like I win. Or haha to my doctor who said I can't do ballet, like I did.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's the same, kind of the same for me too. And the big one for me, of course, is education. You know, I don't necessarily see myself as, you know, an ambassador for every single blind person around, because everyone has different approaches. But yeah, I do hear enough in the integrated communities that I'm part of, that because of me, that, you know, people have opened their minds up a little bit more when it comes to treating people equally, despite differences that they're not entirely comfortable with or they don't know a lot about. And you know, like Nika, I'm also stubborn. You know, and I have the same, I take the same delight in proving people wrong, especially when it comes to my blindness. But I think another one for me too is just the fact that, and this isn't just blindness. This is any sort of social, political, religious bubble. You know, when you stay in it, you can only learn a certain amount. Whereas when you break out of it a little bit, it might be uncomfortable, but I think at the end of the day, you learn a lot more than kind of always staying in your comfort zone. And again, but that's again not just blindness related. That's any sort of, you know, expanding your own horizons, right? And that's why we say that so much. It's because when you stay in one place, things stagnate, and when you don't, then you get to expose yourself to more different things, and you know, you grow through that too.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with Nika and Clement. I'm also very stubborn. I think that's just everyone here, a common theme for us.
Yes.
But I think, like, generally what I would say that you learn is, or the benefit would be skills. I think, of course, one big being advocacy. I think that's something that no matter how much someone tells you about, you don't learn without experience. Personally, what I've learned. And integrated programs or just school always taught me how to properly advocate for myself, because up until I would say grade 7 or something, my mom was doing that for me. But another thing I would say, and it's an unfortunate truth that I've learned, is that integrated programs have more opportunities than I think segregated programs do, just because usually they have more participants or more, like, a wider scope.
Yes.
So you get to learn more just skills overall through them, I've learned. So one example is a martial art, and Clem, you're going to love this story, a martial art, a Sikh martial art called Gatka, that I think I briefly talked about in one of our other podcasts, that I wanted to learn when I was in grade 3 in my school. And they straight up refused me because when I went to the teacher to try out, he said, "You're blind, you can't do it," and didn't even give me a chance. I went home, told my mom being the mom that she is, came and yelled at the teacher saying, "This is not fair. Educate yourself. She can do it. You didn't even give her a chance. If she failed when she auditioned, then fine. But I refuse to not even like you give her a chance." I did it. I tried out. I did end up, I don't know if he was just scared and he gave it to me, or I did well and I got in. But I did learn Gatka for about a couple of years after that. And as hard as I did try to find one for visually impaired or blind people, I could not find one. Because it wasn't being offered in my school or any other academy that I found. So I think, like, you do definitely get to learn skills outside of, I think, that are offered in segregated programs.
Yeah, and I think just one thing really quickly that kind of leads off from what you said, I think problem-solving skills are one of the biggest things that we can learn. Because when there's no workaround that's already kind of established, you have to figure out a new one. And for me, that's one of the biggest skills, along with advocacy. Those are the two biggest, I would say.
Yeah, sure.
Ishita, I love that your mom did that. Like, our mom should get together and exchange war stories, because mine does that with like academic stuff. Like when this one pre-calc teacher in grade 11 said I couldn't do the course and like wanted to like try and kick me out of his class, she went like full on Persian on him.
It's funny because my mom's also like the opposite. When I mess up, she's like, you take ownership of what you did. I was a terrible French student. I hated French. I'm sorry to anyone who speaks French out there.
So did most of us. And I speak French,
was so bad at it. And it was just me. I didn't care to try. And when I, slipped up and didn't do well in an exam, my mom went to go see my teacher at a parent-teacher conference. And my teacher was waiting for her to say, give my student another chance. Give my daughter another chance. It's not fair, because she's so used to hearing that from other parents. My mom just like, good, you gave her a C. She deserves it.
Yeah.
She'll learn that way. And the teacher was so taken aback, like, what? That's new. And my mom, like when I came home, she's like, you absolutely deserve that. You need to work harder in order to get the grade that you deserve. Because she's like, I know you can get an A. You did not try, and we both know. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. So it goes both ways for her.
I think those are great examples of the benefits of integration. So let's move on to some examples of segregation. So, I mentioned our podcast last week with Lily from the School for the Blind. That's a really good example of segregation. I think also Blind Beginnings programs generally is segregation, right? The CNIB camp that I went to as a kid. Do you guys have examples of other segregated programs?
I was in a lot of, when I was younger, just things like disability yoga, like dance classes, adaptive dance classes, different sports. I am in a Taekwondo Plus program, which is actually specifically for people with cognitive disabilities, and I don't have a cognitive disability, but they put me in that class anyway.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I'm also swim, and I'm in the Paralympic program, so that's also kind of more segregated because I don't have a lot of opportunities to talk to other people in the club.
Right. Yes.
Sports are one of the biggest ones, right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, so what I would refer to as like pan disability, where lumping people with disabilities together into a group.
Yeah,
and in my experience, that doesn't always work.
Yes.
Being the only person who's blind. For me, when I was a competitive swimmer, they created this adapted group. We were called the Functional Elite. And everybody had most of them had cerebral palsy. Most of the swimmers had cerebral palsy. I think one person had spina bifida, and then I was blind. And I swam faster than everybody because my actual arms and legs, my body is not impaired in any way. And so it made sense logically that I would swim faster, but we were all in the same lane together. So I was constantly bumping into all the other swimmers. Yes. Because I would be lapping them and I'd have to pass them, except I couldn't see until I was literally on top of them in some cases. So they didn't like me. And it ended up becoming pretty awful, actually.
And it probably created a lot of conflicts too, right?
It did. There was some bullying that ended up happening, and they kind of ganged up on me. And so it didn't work out. And I think that experience that you've just described, Nika, like what's it like being in a program where everyone has a cognitive disability and you don't? That sounds really lonely.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is for me, I'm very focused. And of course, I understand that with severe ADHD or with autism spectrum disorder, it might be hard. And some people have special interests that they fixate on, but it's frustrating when I just want to get on with the training. And in the adult program, you're able to basically test for your belt whenever you're ready. Whereas for this program, they only hold a test every 3 months. So, for example, on December 18th, they're holding a test and I'm busy. and my instructor says I'm ready to progress to my next belt, but because I'm too busy to make the test, I won't be able to receive my yellow stripe belt until probably March, even though I was ready for it way before. So I feel held back. Another experience where kind of a pan disability program didn't work for me was when I was trying to find a dance studio. There was an adaptive dance class I was in, and everyone in the class was either a wheelchair user or used a walker. And if they didn't use any type of mobility device, they had maybe some type of cerebral palsy or something that impacted their range of movement. And I was just really eager to learn, and I wanted to learn technique, and I was very kind of type A, wanting to do everything perfectly. And the instructor got mad at me for basically showing off because I was spinning and turning and jumping, and she was saying that it would make everyone else feel bad. And that was kind of really frustrating, again, because I wanted to focus on my training. And I think at the time I was very angry at the class, and now that I'm older, I have more compassion, and I think there is a need for these classes. I just think I needed something different.
Yeah.
Well, that also reminds me, in high school, I was put in a rehab, they called it a rehab PE class for students with disabilities. So it was grade 8 to 10. That was my PE class in grade 8, 9, and 10. And again, I was the only student with a visual impairment. So we were still doing the regular curriculum. We were still doing volleyball and basketball and badminton. And we were trying to use a beach ball instead of a volleyball, or this giant birdie that doesn't even fly through the air, which I still can't see. Or, it was like, this still doesn't work for me. So a lot of the time I was in the weight room by myself, or riding a stationary bike or running around the track by myself, because it didn't work. And I just think you can't lump all disabilities together and think that that's going to work.
For sure. And, it's really funny kind of when you put that into a smaller context in terms of just blind and visually impaired people as well. Sometimes two people of the same vision level even will have different needs. And my own experience comes from judo. When I tried it for a couple months, and they said, oh, well, we've had other blind judo people here before. And so we think this is the best way for you to fight. And, I would train and I would do my best to learn, the way they thought. But at the same time, my body just didn't like it. There wasn't, it was part of me that kind of went, I don't move like that. Like, that's not the way I think best. That's not the way that's not the best way my body works. There are things that make more sense to me that I'm not allowed to do because they don't think it's good for me to fight this way because I'm blind. So it's really interesting how, pan disability approaches, or kind of just generally, blanket approaches where they say, oh, everybody like this has to be like that, doesn't really work.
I think, I mean, there's definitely been some examples where segregation has been beneficial.
Yes.
One I can think of is Blind Beginnings a few years ago organized a first aid course for our volunteers and members, and the majority of us were blind. And I've taken first aid on my own in a typical integrated situation where they weren't going to let me have a certificate because I wouldn't be able to see blood, or, there's just always been a lot of concerns about, well, how would you handle an emergency or a situation, a medical emergency? Whereas once we fought to have this class, which did take a lot of advocating, they were super impressed with how we learned the material. Everyone did really well on their test. Everyone was able to do the practical stuff. We could take a little extra time if we needed for hands-on. Everyone there understood what our needs would be. And they made some accommodations for the way they gave us the test at the end, the written tests. And it was a positive experience.
It was awesome. I loved it. I remember that course actually because I was one of the people who took it, and I remember we did our food safe one too. Do you remember that, Shawn?
Yep.
And that was another experience where it did help to have everybody in one room, and it wasn't integrated with blind and sighted people. Sure, you know, I love integration, but again, at the same time, like I said earlier, I recognize that there are times when it's, you know, I think segregation has a really negative connotation to it because of history and because of what that means. But I think there are times when, yes, it is helpful to do something like that. So the fact that we did our courses in an environment where everybody was blind or visually impaired, we could have kind of figure out what everybody needed as individuals or take more time. You know, because I think one thing we deal with as people who like to integrate in circumstances sometimes is the fact that we feel like we drag other people down. I don't know if Nika, Ishita, you guys feel this way, but I definitely do. There's a sense that, man, I need to keep up with everyone else, and if I don't keep up, then I'm slowing the crowd down and I'm doing something wrong.
Oh yeah, for sure. I am just a worrywart. Like I just worry about everything all the time.
Yeah.
I think Clement and Nika can contest to that. I'm stressed all the time. And when I'm in like even in university, like when I'm just transiting or when I'm going, like I'm always constantly worried about standing out, or again, like Clement said, bringing people back. Like I actually did a first aid course as well. And I was a little bit slower than everyone else. And everyone, you know, like one thing when we were doing the CPR, the instructor just said, you just push down on the chest. And what I thought the chest to be was actually the neck. And I was pushing down on the neck and they're like, you just killed the person. You're not saying that. But I'm like, oh, cool. Like, okay. So I did it again. And like, you know, it's stuff like you are left behind. And I will say, like, my experience with the segregation is very recent with Blind Beginnings. I think this is the only program that I've been in that relates to like anyone else. So people around me also being visually impaired. And I recently wrote a blog about this, but like with the youth leadership training, with creating connections, anything I've done, I come back from it and I'm like, wow, I did not even consider like anything about like anxiety was just gone relating to like bringing people, like slowing them down or like feeling awkward or like, cause everything is just so seamless and smooth. And absolutely like one of the many things that I love about Blind Beginnings. And I'm sure if I went to other segregated programs, which I'm hopefully planning to do in the future, I will feel the same way. And that's something that cannot be matched in my opinion.
That's true.
Yes. I actually said recently, I think it was on one of the podcasts, that I feel there was a point in my life in my 20s where I realized I had a different personality in it with other people who are blind versus the regular world, the rest of the world. And it was all about that anxiety, right? It's like, oh, I can just be here. I don't have to impress. I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to explain anything. I don't have to advocate for anything. So yeah, that is beautiful.
And I think there's something to be said about the different, almost, I guess, levels of segregation, because the reason why I love Blind Beginnings is because, well, Shawn, you founded it and you have that lived experience and you work there and you have a hand in everything Blind Beginnings does. Whereas I more kind of get frustrated when disability or blindness specific programs are run by sighted people or able-bodied people. For example, let's say you're teaching me, Shawn, how to do something, and let's say one way doesn't work and the other way does. You know automatically not to assume that every blind person does it that way. You know that we're all individuals, whereas in a lot of the programs that I'm in, like swimming, there's so much like red tape and just bureaucratic stuff to deal with, like how they won't let me swim without a tapper. And I'm sure like Clement, you can attest to that in terms of like martial arts stuff.
For sure, absolutely. Like there's, you know, there's so many martial arts. I mean, Nika, you already mentioned that your club's program is like that, right? Where they kind of it's a program for disabled practitioners, but it's run by sighted or able-bodied practitioners, right? And so it gets complicated because I remember, did you tell me that you can only get up to a certain rank in that program?
Yes. So my dojo for everyone goes up to like a 2nd degree black belt. And for the program that I'm in, they said they only go up to a red belt, which is, I think, the 7th or 8th level.
Oh.
Yeah. So, it is, there are immense, benefits to both. But, like bringing it back on focus, I do agree that there are certain times, like, and, like a lot of the things that we've done at Blind Beginnings, whether that is trying out martial arts or learning life skills, even, it's so much more helpful, like Nika said, because Shawn, and those of us who volunteer or the people who help out also know that every individual has different ways that work better for them. Some blind people learn better with hands-on experience. Some blind people learn better with uh, visual indicators or visual explanations. Some people learn, through auditory. So it's really interesting to think about how that really does make a lot of sense when you have people who are disabled in charge, and how that helps because it's easier for us to really understand more than just on an intellectual level how to work with everyone who's in the room, as opposed to people who are like, oh, I've never worked with blind kids before and there's 10 of them sitting here, what do I do?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the other programs that I'm thinking of is our community discovery program, which is basically like a family field trip, right?
Uh-huh.
And if you think about field trips in school, you go to the aquarium, pretty visual, not a fan of the aquarium, not
Yep.
gonna lie.
Yep.
But when
I agree.
But when Blind Beginnings goes to the aquarium, we go in the back to the touch lab and we get to put our hands in stuff. And I mean, maybe you can do that in the school field trip. I don't know. I don't know, but we look for those opportunities where we're going to do the extra thing. We're going to get, because I know what I missed out on as a kid, right? I know what I still don't know what certain things look like because I never got a chance to touch it or experience it fully in a way that made sense to me. So yeah, that's, I think, another example where segregating the group, which it's not really full segregating because families are there with sighted siblings and parents, but it's also showing those individuals, this is the extra things we need to make this meaningful, right?
Yeah. And that's what I love about our volunteer crews, Shawn. I do love that. Yeah, as someone who's now volunteering, I love that it's a mix of sighted and blind volunteers, and they get to ask us questions and we get to ask them for help figuring out something or explaining something that maybe we don't understand either. So it's a great, like you said, it's not full segregation because it's not like it's not like we tell the sighted blind, the sighted people to get out, like that would be something different. But I feel like everybody gets to learn a lot from each other, and I think that's really where segregation can work very well.
Yeah, it's really not black and white. It's really not one or the other, right?
Sure.
It's like there are benefits to both. One thing I was thinking of is like the benefits of integration for the advancement of society as a whole.
Yes.
And you guys mentioned some of that, like, Nika going into dance or gymnastics, and there's a whole new group of people who now understand how to interact with somebody who is blind.
Yeah. And I've been told that multiple times. So I mentioned before on the podcast and I wrote a blog that I do Aikido as a martial art, and in my dojo it's also the same thing. A lot of people have told me multiple times that they know now how to work, not just with me, but just they've learned to tailor their style to different people, and they've learned to be more adaptable, and they wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for me joining them. And it's really cool because that is, that what Ishita talked about not that feeling of, I don't have to worry about being left behind. And Shawn mentioned it too. It's not being left behind and can just do my best and be like everyone else. Of course, there is, still a degree of that. But, one thing I've learned through being in that integrated environment where it's positive is that, well, everyone feels like that. My instructor always says, when she goes back to Japan and practices with people who practice twice a day, 7 days out of a week, she feels like she's being left behind too. So, it's really comforting, I think, to be in environments where sighted people will tell you the same thing. They'll be like, you feel left behind? Guess what? I do too. And it's like, oh, good. It's not just me, and it's not just a blind thing, so it's definitely it's so helpful to have.
I do feel like there's a lot of work that has to happen initially
Yes.
in those settings, right? And I was going to ask Ishita, since that's been most of your experience,
Uh-huh.
most of your life. I know for me, there's always that initial like, oh, apprehension that people
Yeah.
might have for me
Yeah.
to join. And then making everyone else in the group comfortable with my visual impairment is a thing I have to do. And the problem solving that Clement mentioned.
Mhm.
And the advocating, right? Like, so
all of those things.
what was
Yeah.
that experience for you, Ishita?
It's a lot in one word. It's like you said, you have to tend to you're the one, like the spotlight's on you. And I was very uncomfortable with that when I was younger. I hated people even just looking at me, let alone having to explain what my visual acuity is, like how they can work with me. Like I hated group projects. I found it the worst thing because oftentimes I was not contributing to it. I was just picking up garbage and putting that away and, not actually, even though I knew the subject, and it was that assumption that I couldn't do anything that really, and again, as I got older, I got a lot better at saying, demanding that I be an equal and saying like, no, I can contribute to this just as well as you can. So, but like one thing that Nika mentioned is that she's a part of some youth councils. And I've talked about this in Exploring Work Wednesday, that I actually help run a youth council. And we recently had a meeting on accessibility. We talk about a lot of different topics, but accessibility is always a big one. And of course, I'm the go-to person to talk to about it because I'm the only one in the council with any sort of disability. And a lot of the times, I just go off on those meetings because I just love talking about accessibility, but I always tend to hold myself back saying, this is a place for people to learn. It's not your job to teach them everything. You want them to understand certain things. Yes, correct misunderstandings. But what I tend to do is, instead of just explaining how things work, I propose it to them. I say, I'm in a situation like this. A person with a certain kind of disability is in this situation. What do you think happens? And then they give me their response and I say, okay, but what about this? Like I try to educate them in a way that makes them think, other than me just speaking at them. And I've adapted that in every aspect of my life when people have like asked me questions or anything like that. And one thing I use is blind jokes a lot. I find it like, it does make people uncomfortable, and I'm very sinister that I like that feeling when people are like, oh, I'm just like that. But I've noticed that, I've been around sighted people my whole life. It opens up the conversation. It makes them comfortable to talk to you then, because they're like, oh, you have a sense of humor about it. Yes. Oh, like, it works. I can actually talk to you. It's not a serious thing. I'm like, it's not. It's just my way of life. I make blind jokes probably excessively to this point. But it really does like help take that pressure off. And I've used that so much in my life. And of course, combined with educating people, combined with having patience, that's a big thing. I think that you need to, you do tend to learn and integrate this situations that people just don't understand, and it's okay. It's not my job to educate everyone. That's fine. And if, you try your best, and if it doesn't work out, that's okay. Like having that contentment with it too is something that I've learned as well.
Yes.
It's such a journey. It's so like, it is a lot of work, but then when it works, it's so beneficial, right? Like there's this whole new group of people who understands visual impairment in a different way, who sees you as a human, who is like, understands some of the accommodations that can, really small things that can make a big difference. They start thinking about things in a new way. Like it really does pay off, but you got to like persevere through all of that to get to that place.
And it's really interesting. It's not even just one place, but you might spend most of your life, I know this is my personal experience, is you spend most of your life learning how to do that and trying, and having to face people who say no repeatedly, and you try to advocate over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and you keep learning all the way. And then when you finally find that one place out of a million where it works, you do realize how worth the wait it was. So whether that's months, taking months to advocate for a specific thing in school and then finally having it work, or spending your whole life advocating to 5 or 6 different places and then finding one that works on the 7th try. That's always such a worthwhile feeling, when it finally does kind of click into place.
One thing I did notice, we talked about this quite a bit as a benefit for integration being education. But I think like a lot of people would have the thought that could be a negative as well, having to constantly educate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you don't need to do in segregation.
Yes,
like we talked,
true.
So it's so easy. You don't need to be telling people, of course, not in like those pan disability situations, generally more when you're with other people with visual impairments. You don't. I remember this so clearly. This is my first interaction with Clement. It was when I met him.
I don't know if I should be happy about this or scared that you're going to
it's well, you'll see. No, it's good. It's like the thing that like made me want to be his friend, I would say. It was when I met him, and we were talking about our vision, and I was explaining like what my visual vision was. I didn't have a condition at that point. I wasn't diagnosed. I was just explaining how I saw. And he looks at me, he goes, "That's so complicated. I just say I can't see and it's easy like that. I feel so bad for you." And I'm like, whoa. Like
I can't believe
you did say that. And I was like, because that was my first actual interaction with other people with disability. It was a blind beginning sports day, and that was the first day I met Shawn and Nika as well. And it was years ago when I was about like 13, I think. And up until that point, I've always been told you have it better because there are people out there who have less vision than you.
Right.
I've always been told that. They're like, be grateful for the vision you have, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, took that mentality saying, I'm one of the fortunate ones. And of course, I don't hold that anymore. But Clement really made me realize like, it's not black and white. It's not just because I have more vision, I am quote unquote in a better situation. That's not the case. And it really like flipped my perception a lot. And that sports day was so much fun. Like I got to learn how to play goalball. There was so much I didn't know because I came from integrated. I came from integrated situations. I was learning like so much that day, just in that one day. And I'm like, I was fucked. I'm like, I'm joining Blind Beginnings one day.
And so that's another area I think, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but sports, right? Sometimes segregation can actually be helpful to have days like that when we take time to do multiple sports, because it's nice to be able to take as much time as you need rather than being the one person in a, like Shawn mentioned, in a high school PE class where you feel like you have to do, you either have to keep up with everyone else as best you can, or you kind of sit off to the side and do your own thing. So I think that's another time when segregation can work very well, is when you don't have to sit off to the side and just watch everyone else play, because it's a sport that's, there are sports that are picked specifically because everyone can do them.
That's, I think, one of the biggest frustrations about the pan disability experience for me is that I still felt isolated. I still felt like it didn't work for me. And I'm like, okay, if it doesn't work for me, even in this group for people like me, then I don't fit anywhere. That's kind of the takeaway, right?
Yeah.
And I like when I was a swimmer, it would have made more sense to make me, I was 18, 19, put me with the 15-year-olds then.
Yeah.
If that's my level, I'll swim with them, but at least I'm not going to be trampling all over everyone in the lane. They can see me and get out of my way. They're, it just, why did you lump me with the people with the functional, with a mobility impairment? That just didn't make sense.
Right. And it's kind of the opposite end, kind of the opposite side of the same coin, right? Earlier we were talking about feeling awkward because you're being left behind. But then there are other times when you feel awkward because, in those pan disability situations where you're like, I don't feel like I'm here because what's challenging for this particular group of people isn't challenging for me.
Yeah.
And, then what do you do? And like you said, that led to all sorts of ganging up and drama and problems that wouldn't have happened if you had been integrated into,
Yes. And later, when I transferred to university, I swam with like a master's swim club, which is just for anybody who's older than 20. And it was perfect. No problem at all. I was at the same level. I was the only person who was blind or had a disability of any kind that I'm aware of. And it worked out great. So yeah, it's not straightforward. Yeah. And I feel like people are trying in creating these groups for people with disabilities. They're trying, but you can't know everybody's needs. You can't know one size does not fit all, sadly. So doesn't always work. Yeah.
It also, I think, depends on the program and the people teaching it, just because there's some integrated programs I've done, like gymnastics, that worked really well for me and that I didn't really need too much adaptation for. And then there's programs like I was in musical theater, and there was a lot of feeling left behind in that. It was a 1-month intensive program, 8-hour rehearsals every day. And a lot of times for dance, I would have to like sit on the side and watch everyone, or like they even straight up told me, you have a really, really good voice and we want to give you a bigger part so you can sing more songs because you have a beautiful voice. But because blocking and doing like acting on stage, it would be way more work. We're just going to give you like the smallest role, basically. Mm. And I'm like, thanks, I'm a good singer, but I guess too much work.
Yeah, too much work. That's the thing, right?
That's the line, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it is, Nika's right. The instructor or the whoever's leading the program makes a huge difference, whether it is integrated or segregated. I feel like depending on who's in charge and how much they kind of let you push yourself,
and be sensitive to that feeling of being too much work, right?
Exactly.
Like if the person leading wants you there, values your contribution, and is willing to figure out a way so that you're not too much work or so that you can fully contribute, then that's amazing. That's magic. Yeah. But sometimes they're not. They're like, I have to let you be here because I can't discriminate, but I'm not going to do anything extra to make it work. Yeah. That's a terrible experience.
And
that happens in employment.
My gymnastics coach, I was telling her the story about like my taekwondo situation, and she was more outraged about it than I. He was like, oh no, you need to take this to the media. You need to go to them, tell them to put you in an adult class. Gymnastics is more difficult than taekwondo and you're thriving in this class. There's no excuse why you shouldn't be in an adult class. Like, you need to do this. Like every class I go, she's like, so did you talk to the taekwondo people yet?
One thing that is related to that, one of the things that I really got encouraged by when going back to Aikido after COVID was, there was a lot of worries about learning from a distance or being able to, do things hands-on. And I remember one thing my instructor said to me was, she said, look, I have a philosophy in life, and that is everyone around me is my teacher. And I get to learn from everyone I interact with. And that was such a freeing thing to hear from someone who's able-bodied, who's done this thing for 40 years, and should, by rights, have the ability to say, look, I get to tell you what to do. I get to make the decisions. You follow the way I like it. But when the person in charge does make you feel like, look, I want to learn from you. I want to learn what you can do. And, like Shawn said, when they make you feel like they want you there and they want you to contribute, like the fact that they asked me recently to make a visual flyer for a Christmas party, and I was like, I can't do that. I've never done that before. And they were like, just try it and then send it to us and we'll check it. And I was like, okay. Little things like that. I think, like Shawn said, little things that make a huge difference, I think.
Yeah. One thing I've learned just from this conversation alone, but in life, is also with segregation and integration, individuality gets lost very quickly.
Yes.
Oftentimes,
with both.
With both. It's the disability that tends to define you. In like you said, in the blanket situations, you have a disability, therefore you go with the other kids that have disability. It's not you, and we're not looking at necessarily your needs, but also with individuality, you're trying to keep up with everyone sometimes it's just, or you are highlighted as the one who was blind or the one who has a disability. I think if we learned anything, it's that look at the individual. Like we said, they have their own special skills. You know, like Clement, you said they wanted you to do it, and there was a reason why they wanted you to do it, regardless of it was going to be difficult for you. You didn't even may have like known. You said like I can't do it, but they saw that you could. They believed in you, and you gave it a try. And there you go. Like I think that's something that's like focus on the individual. And as hard as it can be in group settings, I understand like it's not always a possibility. It's to the extent as much as you can. The little changes, just asking them, pulling them aside, talking to them as the person makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. I think it's been really, really great.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's so good to be on.
You've been listening to Limitless, the Blind Beginnings podcast. If you have a question, a comment, a future topic request, we'd love to hear from you. Please send us an email to limitless@blindbeginnings.ca. Please share our podcast, like, subscribe, and join us next time.
This podcast has been brought to you by Blind Beginnings, an organization based in Vancouver, Canada, that supports children and youth who are blind or partially sighted, along with their families. Music for this podcast is composed by Shawn Bishop and Clement Chow. Production and audio editing by Rob Minot. For more information about Blind Beginnings and the work it does to support children and youth who are blind and partially sighted, along with their families, visit us on the web at www.blindbeginnings.ca, and also remember to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.